Look at the person next to you. Really look. The shape of their nose, the bridge, the width of their nostrils. Now think about someone from a completely different part of the world. Chances are their nose looks different. Not better, not worse, just different. And here's the thing that should blow your mind. Those differences aren't random. They're not accidents. They're ancient messages written in flesh and bone, telling stories of ice ages your ancestors survived, migrations they made, climates they conquered. Human faces are history books. Every curve, every angle, every small variation is a chapter about where we've been and what we've endured. And nowhere is this more visible than our noses. That small pyramid of cartilage and bone sitting in the middle of your face. It's carrying information from 50,000 years ago, maybe longer. So here's the question that scientists have been obsessed with for over a century. Why do Asian populations tend to have flatter, broader noses compared to Europeans or Africans? And what does this tell us about the greatest migration story in human history? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, São Paulo in the afternoon, all watching the same story unfold. There's something beautiful about that. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about what this video is and isn't. This isn't about beauty standards or ranking features. This isn't about better or worse. This is about the absolutely fascinating science of human adaptation. It's about understanding how our ancestors' bodies changed in response to the environments they encountered. How ice ages and deserts and mountains literally reshaped human anatomy over thousands of generations. Because here's what most people don't realize. Your nose isn't just for smelling things or holding up your glasses. It's a highly sophisticated piece of climate control equipment. It's an air conditioner, a humidifier, and a filter all rolled into one. And like any piece of equipment, its design varies depending on what job it needs to do. The shape of your nose was determined by the climate your ancestors lived in 20,000 years ago. Not the climate you live in now, not where your parents were born, but where your distant ancestors spent thousands upon thousands of years breathing frigid Siberian air, or humid tropical winds, or the dry heat of the African savanna. This is the story of how a handful of anatomical changes, measured in millimeters, reveal one of the most epic journeys in human history, the journey of small groups of humans leaving Africa and walking into climates their bodies had never experienced before, climates that should have killed them, but they didn't die. Instead, over countless generations, their bodies changed, adapted, evolved, and one of the most visible changes happened right in the middle of their faces. We're going to follow this journey together. We'll start with the science of noses, which is way more interesting than you'd think. Then we'll trace the path of ancient humans as they left Africa around 60,000 years ago and began spreading across the world. We'll watch as they encountered the massive glaciers of Ice Age Europe, as they pushed into the frozen steppes of Siberia, where winter temperatures could drop to -40 degrees, as their bodies began to transform in response to air so cold it could damage their lungs with every breath. We'll explore the genetic evidence that's been uncovered just in the last decade, DNA studies that can tell us not just where our ancestors went, but how their anatomy changed along the way. We'll look at the alternative theories, the complications, the questions scientists are still trying to answer. And here's what makes this story so powerful. It's not ancient history. It's written on your face right now. Every time you take a breath, you're using a piece of biological engineering that was refined over 50,000 years of human survival in hostile climates. Your nose is a time machine, and if you know how to read it, it can tell you stories about ice ages and migrations and the incredible adaptability of the human species. So get comfortable, relax, Let's trace the journey from the warm African savanna to the frozen heart of Asia, and discover why evolution decided to reshape one of the most prominent features on the human face. The answer is more surprising than you think. Before we can understand why Asian populations developed smaller nasal features, we need to understand what a nose actually is. Not just the visible part sticking out of your face, but the entire sophisticated biological system that's been keeping you alive since your first breath. Your nose is an air conditioner. That's not a metaphor. It's literally performing the same functions as the climate control system in your house, except it's been doing it for millions of years with zero electricity and maintenance requirements that would make any engineer weep with envy. Every breath you take brings in air that's wrong. Too cold or too hot, too dry or too humid, filled with dust, pollen, bacteria, viruses, and countless microscopic particles that would damage your delicate lung tissue if they got that far. Your lungs need air that's precisely conditioned, warmed to around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, humidified to near 100% relative humidity, and thoroughly filtered of anything larger than a few microns. The nose does all of this in the fraction of a second between inhalation and the air reaching your lungs. Here's how it works. Air enters through your nostrils, those external openings that everyone can see. The width of these openings matters more than you might think. Wider nostrils allow more air to flow in quickly, useful if you're in a hot environment where you need rapid cooling through evaporation. Narrower nostrils slow the air down, giving the internal structures more time to warm and humidify it before it reaches the lungs. Once inside, the air encounters the nasal cavity, a space that's far more complex than most people imagine. It's not just an empty tube. It's filled with elaborate structures called turbinates, curved shelves of bone covered in mucous membrane that force incoming air through a winding pathway. Think of it like a maze designed by an engineer obsessed with maximizing surface area. The air has to navigate through these tight passages, bringing it into contact with warm, moist tissue that begins the conditioning process. This is where the magic happens. The nasal mucosa, that soft tissue lining the entire nasal cavity, is one of the most metabolically active tissues in your body. It's absolutely packed with blood vessels that keep it warm. When cold air flows past, heat transfers from the tissue to the air almost instantly. At the same time, the mucosa is constantly producing moisture, a thin layer of mucus that humidifies the air as it passes. The turbinates increase the surface area of this tissue by an enormous amount. If you could flatten out all the mucosa inside your nose, it would cover an area roughly the size of a large handkerchief. All of that surface is working simultaneously to condition every cubic centimetre of air you breathe. But it gets more sophisticated. The nose doesn't just heat and humidify, it also recovers resources during exhalation. When you breathe out, the air leaving your lungs is warm and saturated with moisture. If all that heat and humidity just escaped, you'd rapidly become hypothermic and dehydrated, especially in cold, dry environments. The turbinates capture much of this warmth and moisture as the air exits, then transfer it back to the next breath coming in. It's a countercurrent heat exchange system, the same principle used in advanced industrial processes, but evolved millions of years ago. Now let's talk about the parts scientists actually measure when studying nasal variation. The nasal index is the ratio of nostril width to the height of the nose. A higher index means wider nostrils relative to height. Populations living in hot, humid environments tend to have higher nasal indices. Populations in cold, dry environments tend to have lower ones. This isn't random. It's one of the clearest examples of climate adaptation in human anatomy. Then there's the nasal bridge, that section between your eyes where the nose connects to your face. Some populations have high nasal bridges with prominent bones, others have low bridges that appear flatter. This affects the length and shape of the nasal passages inside. A higher bridge generally means longer internal passages, which gives the nose more time and space to condition incoming air. The internal architecture matters just as much as the external shape. Some populations have 3 turbinates, the normal human configuration. But the size and shape of these structures vary considerably. Populations adapted to cold climates tend to have larger turbinates with more elaborate surface area. Populations from warmer regions often have smaller, simpler turbinates. The function drives the form. All of this anatomical variation exists because different environments create different challenges for the respiratory system. Breathe cold, dry air directly into your lungs without proper conditioning, and you damage the delicate alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen enters your blood. Do this repeatedly, and you're looking at chronic respiratory problems, reduced oxygen absorption, increased susceptibility to infections. In evolutionary terms, that means lower survival and reproduction rates. Natural selection doesn't care about aesthetics. It cares about function. A nose that efficiently conditions air in your environment increases your chances of surviving long enough to have children who inherit that nose. Over hundreds of generations, this selection pressure shapes populations, creating the remarkable diversity of human nasal anatomy we see today. But the nose does even more than thermoregulation. It's your first line of immune defense. That mucus everyone finds so disgusting. It's packed with antibodies, enzymes, and antimicrobial compounds. It traps pathogens before they can reach your lungs. The tiny hairs in your nostrils, the ones you probably trimmed this morning, they're not decorative. They're filters, catching larger particles that might damage deeper tissues. The mucosa itself contains specialized immune cells that can recognize and respond to threats. When you inhale bacteria or viruses, these cells trigger localized immune responses that can neutralize infections before they establish themselves. Your nose is waging microscopic warfare with every breath, and most of the time it wins so decisively you never even know the battle happened. Different environments present different pathogenic challenges. Cold, dry climates have certain types of airborne threats. Hot, humid regions have others. Over evolutionary time, nasal immune systems adapted to local disease environments, just as nasal structure adapted to local climate conditions. There's also the question of energy efficiency. Warming and humidifying air requires metabolic energy. Your body has to burn calories to maintain that warm, moist mucosa. In cold environments, this energy cost increases dramatically. Every breath of frigid air needs significant warming before it reaches the lungs. The more efficient your nose is at this process, the less energy you waste. In environments where food was scarce and winters were brutal, energy efficiency could mean the difference between surviving until spring or slowly starving as your metabolism struggled to keep up with demands. This might explain why cold-adapted populations didn't just develop larger nasal structures, but more efficient ones. Longer passages, more elaborate turbinates, greater surface area. All of these features increase the nose's ability to condition air, while minimizing energy loss. So when we talk about why Asian populations have smaller noses, we're not talking about some superficial variation. We're talking about a sophisticated piece of biological engineering that was shaped by thousands of generations of natural selection, responding to specific environmental challenges. The question isn't really about nose size at all. It's about how humans adapted to survive in environments that would have killed their ancestors. It's about the incredible precision of evolution when the pressure is intense enough and the time is long enough. And it all starts with understanding that the nose sticking out of your face isn't just a decoration or a simple breathing tube. It's a climate control system refined by millennia of trial and error, success and failure, survival and extinction. Every measurement that scientists take, every ratio they calculate, is a clue to understanding how and where your ancestors lived. Now let's talk about what happens when you take this sophisticated piece of equipment and drop it into radically different environments. Because that's exactly what happened when modern humans began their expansion out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. In 1923, a Scottish anatomist named Arthur Thomson was doing something that probably seemed tedious even by early 20th century academic standards. He was measuring noses, hundreds of them. Not on living people, thankfully, but on skulls collected from populations around the world. He was sitting in his Edinburgh laboratory with calipers and notebooks, carefully recording nasal aperture width, nasal height, and the ratio between them for skull after skull after skull. Most of his colleagues probably thought he was wasting his time. After all, what could nose shape possibly tell us about human evolution? But Thomson was looking for patterns, and what he found would eventually become one of the most cited observations in physical anthropology. Thomson noticed something remarkable. People who lived in cold, dry climates, places like Siberia, Scandinavia, and the northern reaches of Asia, they tended to have narrower nasal passages. Not just slightly narrower, but measurably, consistently narrower. Meanwhile, people from hot, humid regions near the equator, tropical Africa, Southeast Asia, Oceania, they had wider noses, broader nasal apertures that seemed almost deliberately designed to be different from their cold climate counterparts. This wasn't about a few outliers. This was a pattern that held across continents, across ethnic groups, across populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. Thomson's data suggested something that seemed almost too elegant to be true. Human noses had adapted to local climates. They'd been shaped by natural selection to solve specific environmental problems. Thomson published his findings, and for decades they were treated as an interesting curiosity. Maybe even a bit of racial pseudoscience, given the era's unfortunate obsession with categorizing human differences. But Thomson wasn't making claims about superiority or inferiority. He was simply documenting correlations. And over the following century, as genetics and climate physiology advanced, scientists began to understand why Thomson's observations were so consistent. The physics behind it are actually pretty straightforward. When you breathe in cold, dry air, your respiratory system faces a problem. That air needs to be warmed to body temperature and saturated with moisture before it reaches your lungs. If it isn't, you damage the delicate tissues of your airways. You lose precious body heat through every breath. In extreme cold, this can be literally life-threatening. Your nose is your body's first line of defense. It's essentially an air conditioning system running in reverse, warming and humidifying every breath before it goes deeper into your body. And like any engineering system, its efficiency depends heavily on its design. A narrow nasal passage creates turbulence. Air entering through a small opening has to speed up, then slow down as it hits the back of the nasal cavity. It swirls around, bouncing off the walls, passing over ridges and curves inside your nose. All this turbulent flow maximizes contact between the air and the warm, moist mucous membranes lining your nasal cavity. More contact means more heat transfer, more moisture added. By the time the air leaves your nose and enters your throat, it's been transformed from harsh, dry, frigid air into something your lungs can actually use. A wider nasal passage, by contrast, allows air to flow more smoothly with less turbulence. This is actually desirable in hot, humid climates. When the outside air is already warm and moisture-rich, you don't need your nose to do much conditioning. In fact, creating turbulence would just add resistance, making it harder to get enough air during exertion. A wider passage allows more efficient breathing when the environmental conditions don't require extensive air modification. But there's another factor: heat dissipation. In extremely hot environments, your body is constantly trying to dump excess heat. Breathing actually helps with this. Exhaling warm air carries heat away from your body. A wider nasal passage facilitates this heat loss. It's a cooling mechanism, subtle but significant over the course of a day, a lifetime, 1,000 generations. What started as Thomson's simple observation has been tested repeatedly by modern researchers using far more sophisticated methods. In 2017, a team at Penn State University used 3D imaging to analyze nasal passages in populations from across the globe. They didn't just measure external nose shape, they actually mapped the internal architecture, the turbinates and chambers that do the real work of air conditioning. Their findings confirmed Thomson's rule with remarkable precision. Nasal passage volume, turbinate surface area, and the complexity of airflow all correlated strongly with local climate conditions. Populations from cold, dry regions had nasal architectures optimized for warming and humidifying air. Those from hot, humid regions had structures optimized for efficient airflow and heat dissipation. Another study from 2020 used genetic analysis to trace the evolution of nose-shaped genes across human populations. They found evidence of positive selection, meaning natural selection had actively favored certain nose shapes in specific environments. This wasn't just random genetic drift. This was adaptation happening in real time, over just a few thousand generations. The genetic changes involved are surprisingly specific. Variants in genes like DCHS2, RUNX2, and PAX1, all of which influence facial development, show clear geographic patterns. These aren't genes that code for nose shape directly, nothing in genetics is that simple, but they influence the developmental processes that determine how your face grows, including the width of your nasal apertures and the shape of the bones that support them. Population geneticists have tracked these variants spreading through human populations as our ancestors moved into new climates. When groups migrated north into colder regions, variants associated with narrower noses became more common generation by generation. When others remained in tropical zones, variants for broader noses persisted and spread. But here's where it gets complicated. Thomson's rule, elegant as it is, doesn't explain everything. It's a general pattern, not an absolute law, and human variation is far messier than any simple climate-based model would suggest. Take the Inuit populations of the Arctic. They live in one of the coldest, driest environments on Earth. Thomson's rule would predict they should have the narrowest noses of any human population. But they don't. Their noses are relatively broad, more similar to East Asian populations than to Europeans, despite the Arctic climate being far more extreme than anything in Europe. Why? Probably because the Inuit arrived in the Arctic very recently in evolutionary terms, only about 5,000 years ago. That's not enough time for selection to completely reshape nasal architecture. They're still working with the basic facial structure their ancestors brought from East Asia. Natural selection is powerful, but it's also slow. 5,000 years isn't enough to override tens of thousands of years of prior adaptation, or consider populations in high-altitude regions like the Andes and the Himalayas. They face cold, dry air, just like Arctic peoples, but they also face low oxygen levels. The adaptations that help you breathe efficiently in thin air might actually conflict with the adaptations that help you warm cold air. High-altitude populations show diverse nose shapes, suggesting multiple evolutionary solutions to a complex set of challenges. And then there's sexual selection. Humans don't just choose mates based on survival traits. We choose them based on beauty, status, cultural preferences, random chance. If a particular group develops a cultural preference for certain facial features, the preference can drive changes in nose shape completely independent of climate. Over enough generations, cultural selection can be just as powerful as natural selection. Thomson's rule also struggles to account for rapid recent changes in human populations. Over the past few centuries, industrialization, urbanization, and migration have scrambled the relationship between populations and their ancestral climates. People whose ancestors lived in Siberia for 20,000 years now live in Miami. Tropical populations have moved to Alaska. We're mixing faster than evolution can possibly keep up. Despite these complications, Thomson's basic observation holds. Climate has been one of the major forces shaping human nasal diversity. Not the only force, not an all-powerful law, but a consistent, measurable influence that has left its mark on populations worldwide. And here's what makes this truly fascinating. The same principle applies beyond just noses. Body proportions, skin color, hair texture, even metabolic rates show correlations with ancestral climates. Humans have adapted to an incredible range of environments, and each adaptation tells part of the story of where we've been and what challenges we've faced. Thomson was right, even if he couldn't explain exactly why. Human bodies carry the signatures of ancient climates, ancient migrations, ancient decisions about where to live and how to survive. Your nose isn't just a nose. It's a historical document, recording thousands of years of your ancestors' environmental experiences. But to understand how this applies specifically to Asian populations, we need to zoom in on one particular migration. One group of humans who left Africa and walked into an environmental challenge unlike anything their species had ever faced before. Let's go back, way back, to a time when every human who existed lived in Africa. Around 300,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, first emerged somewhere on the African continent. The exact location is still debated. Maybe it was in Ethiopia or Morocco or somewhere in between. But wherever they first appeared, they were distinctly African, and their bodies showed it. The African climate shaped them in countless ways. But for our purposes, let's focus on their noses. Wide nasal passages, broader nostrils, shorter nasal cavities overall. This wasn't random, this was adaptation. The African environment, hot and humid across much of the continent, demanded this particular architecture. Wide nasal passages allowed air to flow freely without needing much modification. When you're breathing air that's already warm and moist, you don't need elaborate internal plumbing to condition it. Your nose can be relatively short and wide without any penalty. In fact, it's actually beneficial. Better cooling, less resistance to airflow, more efficient breathing during the intense physical activity that hunter-gatherer life demanded. For tens of thousands of years, maybe longer, our ancestors lived exclusively within Africa. They spread across the continent, adapting to everything from tropical rainforests to desert margins, but they stayed. Generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium. Africa was home. Africa was the entire world. Then, something changed. The archaeological evidence suggests that around 100,000 years ago, small groups began probing the edges of their known world. Maybe following animal migrations, maybe driven by drought or resource competition, maybe just curious about what lay beyond the horizon. We find their tools and traces in the Middle East, in caves along the eastern Mediterranean. But these early attempts seem to have failed. The groups either died out or turned back. Africa remained home for a while longer. But around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, another wave of migrants left Africa, and this time they didn't come back. This time they kept going. Picture them. A small band, maybe 50 people, maybe fewer, extended families most likely, people who had grown up together, who knew each other's stories, who had survived droughts and celebrations together. They're standing at the southern tip of the Red Sea, looking across narrow waters to the Arabian Peninsula. Maybe the sea level is lower than usual. Climate shifts have exposed land bridges and shallow crossings. Or maybe they've already figured out how to build simple rafts. Either way they cross, and everything changes. They're not trying to conquer the world. That's not how they're thinking. They're just moving to the next valley, the next water source, the next good hunting ground. But each generation moves a little farther, and over thousands of years those small movements add up to something unprecedented. The routes they took are still visible in our DNA. The primary path seems to have hugged coastlines. After crossing into Arabia, they followed the southern coast of Asia, through what's now Yemen, Oman, Pakistan, India. The coast provided reliable resources: shellfish, fish, seabirds, foods that didn't require the elaborate knowledge of local plant species that inland hunting and gathering demanded. You could show up somewhere new and immediately find food. This made rapid expansion possible, but rapid is relative. These weren't organized expeditions marching purposefully towards some destination. Each generation probably moved only a few dozen miles from where their parents had lived, maybe following seasonal migrations of game, maybe splitting off when groups grew too large, maybe fleeing conflicts or searching for better territories. At this pace, just 5 miles per generation, humans could spread from Africa to Southeast Asia in under 15,000 years. And the genetic evidence suggests the process took even longer than that. By 60,000 years ago, humans had reached Southeast Asia and Australia. By 45,000 years ago, they were in Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they had spread throughout the Americas, from a single origin point to every habitable continent, excepting Antarctica, in less than 70,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that's a blink. In human terms, that's 3,000 generations. 3,000 chances for things to go wrong. 3,000 winters to survive. 3,000 summers to make the most of. Most of these migrating groups probably failed. They entered territories where they couldn't find food, or couldn't adapt to local diseases, or got caught in natural disasters, or simply had bad luck with the demographic roulette that determines whether small populations survive. For every group that successfully established itself in new territory, probably dozens vanished without leaving any trace beyond a few scattered stone tools. But some succeeded, and those successful groups began encountering environments radically different from the African homeland their ancestors had left behind, environments that would, over thousands of years, reshape their bodies in fundamental ways. The people moving through the Middle East found a world of extremes: blazing hot days, surprisingly cold nights, dry air that sucked moisture from your lungs, seasonal variations more extreme than anything in tropical Africa. This wasn't the brutal cold they'd encounter farther north, not yet, but it was different enough to start exerting new selective pressures. And here's where the story of noses begins to shift. Those wide, short nasal passages that worked perfectly in humid Africa, they were less ideal here. Breathing cold, dry air through a short nasal cavity meant that air reaching the lungs wasn't properly warmed or moistened. This could lead to respiratory problems, increased water loss through breathing, vulnerability to respiratory infections. Not catastrophic problems, not immediately, but over hundreds of generations, individuals with slightly longer, slightly narrower nasal passages would have small advantages. They'd breathe more efficiently, they'd lose less water, they'd get sick less often, they'd be slightly more likely to survive and have children, and those children would inherit their parents' nose shapes. This is natural selection at its most subtle. No dramatic die-offs. No mass extinctions, just small statistical differences in survival and reproduction compounded over thousands of years. The people who moved into these new territories still looked fundamentally African. Their skin was still dark, their hair still tightly coiled, their bodies still adapted for heat, but their noses were just beginning to shift. Meanwhile, back in Africa, populations that stayed behind kept the ancestral nose shape. Why wouldn't they? It still worked perfectly for their environment. There was no selection pressure pushing them toward narrower nostrils or longer nasal passages. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It only responds to immediate challenges. If your nose works fine, it doesn't change. This created a situation that would play out over tens of thousands of years. African populations maintaining one set of features. Migrant populations now spread across thousands of miles, slowly diverging from the ancestral pattern, not becoming different species, still fully capable of interbreeding, but accumulating small differences, trait by trait, generation by generation. By 50,000 years ago, humans had spread across an enormous range of environments, from tropical Southeast Asia to temperate Mediterranean climates to the edges of the northern steppes, and in each environment, natural selection was working slightly differently. Populations in humid regions maintained broader noses. Populations in drier regions were developing narrower ones. Populations moving into colder areas were developing something else entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, they had to reach those cold places. First, they had to venture into environments unlike anything their ancestors had ever experienced. Environments that would push human adaptation to its limits. The real transformation was still to come. Picture yourself stepping off the warm grasslands of Southeast Asia and turning north. It's 40,000 years ago. Your ancestors made it out of Africa, survived the crossing, established themselves in warmer Asian territories. But some groups keep pushing northward, following herds, seeking new territories, driven by that restless human urge to see what's over the next horizon. They have no idea what's waiting for them. What's waiting is cold. Not the kind of cold you experience on a winter morning, not even the kind of cold you'd feel on the worst day of a modern winter. This is Ice Age cold, glacial maximum cold. Glacial, the kind of cold that kills you if you make a single mistake. Northeast Asia during the last glacial period was one of the most extreme environments humans had ever attempted to colonize. Temperatures in Siberia and northern China regularly dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower. The air was brutally dry, sucked of moisture by the massive ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere. Winds howled across vast treeless steppes with nothing to stop them, creating wind chill factors that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. This wasn't a place humans were designed to live. Our species evolved in tropical Africa. Our bodies were optimized for heat dissipation, not heat retention. Our respiratory systems were built to handle warm, humid air, not air so cold and dry it could damage lung tissue with every breath. But humans went there anyway, and somehow, impossibly, they survived. The fossil record tells us exactly what this survival cost. When archaeologists compare skulls from early Asian populations with their ancestors who stayed in warmer regions, they see systematic changes, not random variations, not individual differences, systematic directional changes affecting multiple features simultaneously, changes that show up generation after generation, getting more pronounced over thousands of years. This is natural selection written in bone. The nose changed first, or at least most obviously. Early migrants to northern Asia had nasal passages similar to their African and Southeast Asian ancestors, relatively wide, relatively flat, optimized for cooling air in warm climates. But within a few thousand years, something remarkable happens. The nasal passages begin to narrow. The nasal bridge rises. The internal turbinates, those delicate scroll-like bones inside your nose, become more elaborate, creating more surface area packed into less space. Why? Because every breath in sub-zero temperatures is a crisis your body has to solve. When you breathe air at minus 40 degrees directly into your lungs, you're not just uncomfortable, you're damaging tissue. The bronchial tubes can become inflamed, ice crystals can form in the respiratory tract. Repeated exposure can cause permanent scarring, reduced lung capacity, chronic respiratory disease. In an environment where you need maximum physical capacity just to survive, respiratory damage is often a death sentence. The nose is your first line of defense. It's not just a decoration on your face. It's a sophisticated climate control system. As air passes through the nasal passages, it comes into contact with warm, moist mucous membranes. Heat transfers from the tissue to the air. Moisture evaporates into the airstream. By the time air reaches your lungs, it's been warmed and humidified to something your body can safely process. But here's the problem. In warm climates, this system works almost effortlessly. In extreme cold, it requires massive heat and moisture transfer happening in milliseconds. The warmer the climate you evolved in, the less efficient your nasal passages are at this extreme conditioning. Your body can do it, but at enormous metabolic cost. You're literally burning extra calories with every breath just to avoid damaging your lungs. Now, imagine two groups of humans living in Ice Age Siberia. Group A has the wider, flatter noses their ancestors brought from Africa. Group B has a random genetic variation that produces slightly narrower nasal passages with slightly more internal surface area. Both groups are breathing the same frozen air, facing the same survival challenges. But Group B has an advantage. Their nasal passages warm and humidify air slightly more efficiently. They burn slightly fewer calories with every breath. They suffer slightly less respiratory damage over the course of a brutal winter. These advantages sound trivial. A few calories here, a tiny reduction in tissue damage there. But multiply those tiny advantages across thousands of breaths per day, across months-long winters, across entire lifetimes. Multiply them across generations. The individuals with more efficient nasal passages survive winters at higher rates. They're healthier, stronger, better able to hunt and gather. They have more children. Those children inherit the nose shape that gave their parents an advantage. Within a few generations, the new nose shape becomes common. Within a few thousand years, it becomes universal. This is classic Darwinian selection. But it's happening fast, at least in evolutionary terms. The archaeological evidence suggests significant changes in Asian facial structure occurred within 10,000 to 20,000 years. That's remarkably rapid for changes in skeletal anatomy. It suggests the selection pressure was intense. Individuals with less cold-adapted features were dying at substantially higher rates than those with more adapted features. But the nose wasn't changing in isolation. Cold adaptation affects the entire facial structure. The skull itself was being reshaped by the demands of Ice Age survival. Anthropologists studying ancient skulls from Northern Asia notice something they call the cold-adapted face. It's a suite of features that appear together, a package deal created by natural selection, operating on multiple traits simultaneously. Narrower nasal passages, yes, but also flatter faces overall, higher cheekbones, more forward-projecting facial bones creating what's sometimes called facial flatness, increased fat deposits in the cheeks and around the eyes. Each feature serves a purpose. The flatter face reduces surface area, minimizing heat loss. It's the same principle that makes a sphere better at retaining heat than a shape, with lots of protruding parts. The higher cheekbones and additional fat deposits protect the sinuses and eyes from freezing. Frostbite in the face isn't just painful, it can destroy the delicate tissues of the nasal passages and sinuses, compromising the very system you need to survive cold winters. Some researchers think the epicanthic fold, the distinctive eyelid shape common in many Asian populations, might also be a cold adaptation. It protects the eye from freezing winds and reduces heat loss around the orbital socket. Others argue it's more related to protection from intense sunlight reflecting off snow and ice, which can cause snow blindness in unprotected eyes. Perhaps it's both. Evolution doesn't optimize for single problems. It creates solutions that work across multiple challenges simultaneously. The evidence for these changes comes from multiple sources. Skeletal remains from ancient burial sites in Siberia show the gradual emergence of cold-adapted features over thousands of years. The oldest remains from early migrants show intermediate features, partway between tropical African anatomy and the fully cold-adapted features of later populations. Remains from 20,000 to 30,000 years ago show features becoming more pronounced. By 10,000 years ago, the cold-adapted facial structure is fully established. Genetic analysis supports this timeline. When researchers compare DNA from ancient humans with modern populations, they can identify specific genetic variants associated with facial structure. Some of these variants show signatures of recent positive selection, meaning they increased in frequency much faster than you'd expect from random genetic drift. They were being actively selected for because they provided survival advantages. But here's where the story gets complicated. Not all Asian populations developed identical features. Northern populations in Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China show the most extreme cold adaptations. Southern populations in Southeast Asia, which never experienced the same extreme cold, retained features closer to their African ancestors. Central Asian populations show intermediate features. This makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. Selection pressure varies by environment. In the coldest regions where winter survival was most challenging, selection for cold-adapted features would be most intense. In warmer regions, those same features might provide no advantage, or might even be disadvantageous. Wide nasal passages that work well in tropical heat might actually be better in Southeast Asian climates than narrow passages optimized for Arctic cold. The result is a gradient, a spectrum of variation across Asia reflecting the spectrum of climates humans colonized. This isn't about one Asian population or one Asian nose shape. It's about thousands of local populations, each adapting to their specific environment, creating the incredible diversity we see across the continent today. Some scientists studying this pattern talk about clines, gradual changes in physical features that track environmental variables like temperature and humidity. If you mapped nose width across Asia, you'd see a gradual transition from wider in the south to narrower in the north. Same with facial flatness. Same with many other features. These clines are exactly what you'd expect if local adaptation to climate was a major force shaping human variation. But evolution doesn't work on a blank canvas. It modifies what already exists. Those early migrants to Asia weren't starting from scratch. They carried genetic variation accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. Some individuals already had slightly narrower noses or flatter faces just from random variation. When they moved into cold environments, selection amplified those pre-existing variations, pulling populations toward the optimal cold-adapted form. This is why the changes happened as fast as they did. Evolution didn't have to wait for new mutations. It just had to select among variations that already existed. The raw material for cold adaptation was already there in the genetic diversity of the founding populations. Natural selection was just the sculptor, chipping away everything that didn't work and preserving everything that did. By 10,000 years ago, the job was essentially done. The populations of Ice Age Asia had been transformed into something new, still fundamentally human, still capable of interbreeding with populations from any other continent, but physically adapted to survive in some of the harshest environments humans had ever colonized. They had paid for that adaptation with generations of suffering, with countless individuals who didn't survive winters, whose less optimal features were quietly removed from the gene pool by natural selection's brutal efficiency. But they had survived. And in surviving, they had written their story in bone and DNA. A story we can still read today, written on every face descended from those ancient cold-adapted populations. A story about what it takes to survive when the world turns frozen and hostile. A story about the incredible power of evolution to reshape the human form in response to environmental pressure. The question is that the whole story? So those migrants who pushed into Asia weren't just walking into a new continent. They were walking into multiple evolutionary laboratories, each one running a different experiment in human adaptation. The most extreme of these laboratories was in the north, Northeast Asia, Siberia. If you think Ice Age Europe was harsh, Siberia during the last glacial maximum made Europe look like a vacation resort. We're talking about 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, the absolute peak of the last ice age. Temperatures in central Siberia regularly dropped to -40, -50 degrees Celsius. Winters lasted 9 months. The sun barely rose above the horizon for weeks at a time, and the wind, the relentless screaming wind that could strip the warmth from your body in minutes if you weren't properly protected. This wasn't a place humans were supposed to survive. Every single physiological system in your body would be screaming at you to go south, to find warmth, to escape. But some groups stayed, or more accurately, some groups pushed even further north, further into the cold, following herds of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros into territories that would have killed their African ancestors in days. Why would anyone do this? Competition, probably. The more hospitable regions of Asia were filling up with people. Groups were competing for the best hunting grounds, the most reliable water sources, the caves and rock shelters that provided protection from weather and predators. So some groups made the calculation that it was better to face extreme cold in territories nobody else wanted than to fight for space in crowded southern regions. They were betting their lives that they could adapt fast enough to survive. And here's the thing about extreme environments and small populations. Evolution doesn't just happen faster, it happens differently. When you have a large population spread across diverse environments, natural selection works slowly and carefully, testing variations across thousands of individuals over many generations. But when you have a small group, maybe 50, maybe 100 people, isolated in an extreme environment where most children die before reaching adulthood, evolution becomes brutal and rapid. This is where genetic drift comes into play alongside natural selection. In small populations, random chance can have massive effects. Maybe the one guy in your group who happens to carry genes for slightly narrower nasal passages has 5 sons who survive to adulthood, while the guy with wider nasal passages has only daughters. Suddenly, through pure chance, the next generation has a much higher frequency of the narrow-nosed genes. Not because narrow noses were necessarily better for survival, but because of random reproductive luck. Multiply this effect across dozens of isolated groups scattered across the Siberian landscape, and you get a kind of evolutionary roulette, each group developing slightly different features, testing different genetic solutions to the same environmental challenges. Most groups probably went extinct. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, which itself tells a story. These weren't thriving populations leaving abundant remains. These were people hanging on by their fingernails, small bands of survivors whose entire existence could be erased by one bad winter, one failed hunt, one outbreak of disease. But some groups made it, and the ones that survived weren't just lucky. They were the ones whose particular combination of genetic traits and cultural innovations happened to work in that specific environment. The archaeological evidence from Siberian sites during this period is absolutely fascinating. These people weren't passive victims of the cold. They were innovative engineers who developed survival technologies that wouldn't be surpassed for thousands of years. At sites like Yana in northern Siberia, dating to about 30,000 years ago, archaeologists have found evidence of semi-subterranean shelters, structures built partially underground to take advantage of the Earth's insulating properties. The walls were probably reinforced with mammoth bones and tusks, covered with multiple layers of animal hides. Inside these shelters, people maintained fires constantly, not just for warmth, but for light during the endless dark winters, for cooking frozen meat, for rendering animal fat into fuel for lamps. The amount of firewood these groups would have needed was staggering. maybe hundreds of kilograms per day during the coldest months. This meant constant foraging expeditions even in brutal weather, teams of people venturing out to collect driftwood along frozen rivers, dead branches from stunted trees, dried dung from mammoth herds. Their clothing was probably the most sophisticated in the world at that time. Multiple layers, carefully tailored from animal skins using bone needles and sinew thread, fur-lined parkas, insulated boots, mittens, face coverings, every opening sealed against the wind. Modern experiments in Arctic survival have shown that without proper clothing, a human can die of hypothermia in Siberian winter conditions in less than an hour. These people had to get clothing technology absolutely right every time, or they simply wouldn't survive. And here's where biological and cultural adaptations start dancing together in ways that are hard to untangle. Did narrower nasal passages evolve because they were genuinely advantageous for breathing extremely cold air? Or did they emerge through genetic drift and simply happen to not be disadvantageous because cultural innovations like face coverings were already protecting the respiratory system? Maybe it was both. Maybe populations that developed good cold weather clothing technology experienced relaxed selection pressure on nasal morphology, allowing greater variation. Or maybe the clothing wasn't quite sufficient, and those individuals with nasal passages that could better condition cold air had a slight survival advantage that, multiplied across hundreds of generations, gradually shifted the population average. We don't know for certain, and that uncertainty is actually important to acknowledge. Evolution in human populations is never simple, never just one factor pushing in one direction. It's always a complex interaction of multiple selective pressures, random genetic drift, cultural practices, and pure historical accident. But what we can say with confidence is that the populations living in Northeast Asia during the last glacial maximum were experiencing extraordinary selective pressures. Child mortality was probably catastrophic, maybe 70 or 80% not surviving to adulthood. Under those conditions, even small advantages matter enormously. If having a slightly narrower nose improved your survival odds by even 1 or 2%, that would be enough for natural selection to gradually increase its frequency in the population. The same logic applies to other facial features that became common in Northeast Asian populations. Epicanthic folds, the skin fold that partially covers the inner corner of the eye, might have provided protection against snow blindness, wind damage, or frostbite. Flatter facial profiles might have reduced the surface area exposed to cold, minimizing heat loss. More subcutaneous facial fat might have provided insulation for delicate structures. Each of these features individually might seem trivial, but together, across hundreds of generations, they could add up to a significant survival advantage in extreme cold environments. And remember, these populations weren't just sitting still. They were moving, mixing, splitting apart, and coming back together. Groups would fragment during harsh winters when food was scarce, then reunite during brief summers. Marriage exchanges would connect distant bands, spreading genetic variants across the landscape. Successful groups would grow and send out migrants to establish new territories. Failed groups would disappear, their genetic contributions lost forever. This created a constantly shifting genetic landscape across Northeast Asia, some variants spreading widely, others remaining localized, all of them being tested constantly against the brutal reality of Ice Age survival. Over 20,000 years from the initial colonization of Northern Asia to the end of the last glacial maximum, this crucible of cold and isolation forged populations that looked distinctly different from their ancestors who had left Africa 40,000 years earlier. They had become specifically, exquisitely adapted to life in the coldest inhabited places on Earth, and when the ice finally began to retreat around 19,000 years ago, when temperatures started slowly rising and new territories opened up, These cold-adapted populations expanded rapidly, carrying their distinctive features south and east, eventually reaching the Pacific coast, crossing into the Americas, spreading across the entire northern tier of the Asian continent. Today, the genetic and physical signatures of that Siberian crucible can be seen in populations from Korea to Alaska, from Mongolia to the Arctic Circle. Not because everyone in these regions has identical features, they don't, but because they share common ancestry in those populations that survived the worst the Ice Age could throw at them, and emerged not just alive, but transformed. These weren't just any humans. These were humans who had been tested by the harshest environment our species would ever voluntarily inhabit, and they had passed the test. By the time your ancestors were facing down Ice Age winds in northern Asia, something quiet was happening inside their cells. No drums, no speeches, no conscious choice, just tiny changes in DNA, replicated billions of times over, passed from parent to child like a whispered message. For most of human history, those messages were invisible. You could see the outcomes, broad noses, narrow noses, high bridges, low bridges, but not the instructions. Then, in the last few decades, we learned how to read the code. And when scientists finally pointed their genetic flashlights at the human face, one thing became very clear. Your nose has a paper trail. Modern geneticists do something that would have seemed like sorcery to your Ice Age ancestors. They gather tens of thousands of people, scan their faces in 3D, measure every curve and angle, then read millions of points along their DNA. Then they ask a simple question. When the shape of the nose changes, which parts of the DNA tend to change with it? Those massive comparisons are called genome-wide association studies, or GWAS. No single person's face means much on its own, but stack 50,000 faces, 100,000 genomes and patterns begin to appear. Little peaks on genetic maps that say, right here, something important is happening for the human face. Over and over again, the same names start showing up. GLI3, DCHS2, PAX1, RUNX2, and, lurking nearby, one gene that would become a legend in East Asian evolution, EDAR. Think of these genes as foremen on a vast construction site. They're not carving cartilage with tiny molecular chisels. They're sending signals. Turn this on, slow that down, grow this tissue a little longer, stop that growth a little earlier. The result is not a single dramatic mutation, but millions of microscopic decisions that, taken together, become something you can see in a mirror. Take GLI3. In the early embryo, long before you have a face, GLI3 is helping lay out the blueprints for the midface region, that central zone from your upper lip up to the bridge of your nose. Tiny shifts in how GLI3 is expressed can nudge the nose slightly higher, slightly lower, a little broader, a little narrower. Not enough to create a new species, but enough to change how air moves through your nasal passages on a freezing winter night. Then there's DCHS2. That gene helps guide how cells stick together and form orderly layers in developing cartilage and bone. Studies have linked variants in DCHS2 with the angle and projection of the nose, how far it extends from the face. A slightly more projecting nose might help in one climate, a slightly flatter one in another. You don't choose it. Natural selection does, by quietly favouring the children who breathe just a little easier. PAX1 plays another role in this quiet architecture. It's part of a family of genes that help sculpt parts of the skull and vertebrae. Certain versions of PAX1 have been tied to changes in the width of the nostrils and the shape of the nasal base. You can think of PAX1 as one of the tuning dials that sets the overall framework, the geometry that other genes will refine. RUNX2 is a different sort of player. It's deeply involved in bone formation. When bones start to harden, how quickly they grow, how long they keep going. Variants in RUNX2 have been associated with the height of the midface and the shape of the nasal bridge. In some populations, selection may have gently favoured combinations of RUNX2 variants that created a slightly different facial profile, perhaps one that worked better with certain chewing patterns, or dissipated cold more effectively, or simply fit harmoniously with other changing features. Individually, none of these genes makes an Asian nose or a European nose or any other kind of nose. They push and pull in tiny increments, like multiple artists working on the same sculpture, each making almost imperceptible adjustments. But when you zoom out over thousands of generations, those faint nudges become clear evolutionary trends. And then there's IDAR. If nose genetics is a quiet conversation, IDAR is the voice that keeps popping up in the middle of everything. IDAR is a gene that helps control how certain tissues develop: hair follicles, sweat glands, teeth, and aspects of facial structure. Around 30,000 to 35,000 years ago, somewhere in East Asia, a particular version of this gene appeared, a variant called EDARV370A. At first, it was just one mutation among billions, but the environment had an opinion about it. In East Asian and some Native American populations today, this EDAR variant is very common. Geneticists can see the telltale signature of strong natural selection around it, a long stretch of DNA where that version spread faster than would be expected by chance. Something about it was clearly useful. We know some of its effects. The EDARV370A variant is associated with thicker, straighter hair shafts. It increases the number of sweat glands. It alters the shape of certain teeth. And, importantly for our story, it seems to subtly influence aspects of facial structure, including midface width and possibly parts of the nasal region. But EDAR is not a nose gene. It's a master switch affecting multiple traits at once. This is called pleiotropy, one genetic change with many downstream effects. Imagine a single policy decision in a city that changes housing, traffic, school locations and water usage all at once. If that policy works well in a particular environment, say a hot, humid climate or a region with specific dietary resources, it can spread rapidly, dragging along all its side effects, including small shifts in face shape. So when you look at East Asian faces today and notice certain common patterns, straighter hair, particular dental traits, certain mid-face features, you're seeing the echoes of an ancient selective event centered on EDAR, superimposed on all the subtler changes shaped by GLI3, DCHS2, PAX1, UNX2, and dozens of other genes still being discovered. When GWAS studies map these facial traits, they also tell us something deeper. They show where evolution has pushed harder. Certain regions of the genome, especially around EDAR and some of the nose-related genes, carry what geneticists call signatures of selection. That means the versions we see today rose to high frequency unusually fast, and they sit in stretches of DNA that look swept clean by recent evolutionary change, like a field where one species of plant has taken over after a fire. In northern Eurasia, for example, some of the genetic variants associated with narrower, more projecting noses show signs of adaptation to cold, dry conditions. In South Asia, different combinations of variants appear, reflecting different climatic and historical pressures. In tropical regions, broader nasal features dominate, tied to a different set of favoured gene combinations. But when you zoom in close, you never find a single switch labelled Asian nose or European nose or African nose. What you see instead is a dense network, dozens, probably hundreds, of genes involved in bone growth, cartilage formation, tissue signalling, hormonal regulation, and developmental timing. Each contributes a fraction of a millimetre here, a subtle angle change there. This is what scientists mean when they say nose shape is polygenic. It's the product of many genes, all acting together, often with overlapping roles. Change one slightly and the effect might be invisible. Change 10 and the overall pattern begins to shift. Change them under the steady pressure of climate, diet, disease, and social patterns for tens of thousands of years, and a continental mosaic of nose shapes emerges. Even then, the story isn't purely genetic. The same DNA can produce slightly different noses depending on nutrition, hormones, early life health, and random developmental variation. Your genome lays out a set of possibilities. Life decides which ones get built. If you could line up all your ancestors from the first bottleneck survivors to the present day and watch their faces change like a time-lapse film, you would not see sudden jumps. You'd see a slow, wavering drift. A slight narrowing here, a gentle flattening there, sometimes reversed, sometimes amplified, as migrations, interbreeding, and new environments shuffled the genetic deck. Neanderthals would step into the line with their massive nasal passages, a different evolutionary experiment in cold adaptation. Denisovans would appear as brief, half-seen figures, leaving traces of their DNA in the people of Tibet, the Philippines and New Guinea, carrying high-altitude adaptations and perhaps their own distinctive facial tendencies. Then, gradually, you'd see the rise of EDA-ARV370A in East Asia, the spread of other nose-related variants across Siberian and Central Asian populations, the echoes of those choices carried into the Americas. Today, when a geneticist looks at a scan of your face and a printout of your genome, they can see these historical shadows. A particular GLI3 variant that first became common in one ancient population. A Runnis-2 combination that might have been favoured in another. The EDAR variant that swept through East Asia like a silent wildfire of adaptation. But they can't reduce you to a list of letters. The same gene that changed nose width in one person might barely affect it in another, because everything depends on the full context. All the other genes, all the environmental signals, all the accidents of development. Your nose is not an answer key. It's a probability curve, a compromise, an evolutionary negotiation. The genetics tells us something humbling. There is no simple, single reason Asians or any other group have the noses they do. There is a tangled web of causes: climate, diet, disease, social patterns, random drift, ancient interbreeding, and the mysterious workings of genes like GLI3, DCHS2, PAX1, RUNX2, and EDAR, all acting together over deep time. What DNA gives us is not certainty, but clarity. It shows us that these differences are not arbitrary, not mystical, not tied to worth or ability. They are the faint signatures of survival strategies, written in code, edited by ice and wind and sunlight, carried forward by people who loved, struggled, and endured. And yet, even the best genetic models can only go so far. Climate shaped the nose, yes, but it did not work alone. To understand the full story, we have to turn from genes to everything else that sculpted the human face: culture, food, chance, and the strange experiments of history. By now the climate story feels almost too neat. Cold air, narrow noses, warm air, broader ones, Asia, somewhere in the middle. It fits. It makes sense. It lines up beautifully with what we see in the fossil record and in modern populations. But human evolution almost never runs on a single track. It's not a clean engineering problem where nature says, cold climate, installing nasal upgrade now. It's more like 1,000 different currents tugging on the same small boat, each one shifting the course a little bit. Climate is one of those currents, a powerful one, but not the only one. So as your mind starts to drift and your breathing slows, let's gently peel back that simple climate story and look at some of the other forces that might have shaped the noses we see in Asia today. Start with something much less tangible than temperature or humidity: desire. Sexual selection is evolution's strange, subjective cousin. Natural selection cares about survival. Sexual selection cares about attraction. It doesn't ask, will this help you live? It asks, will this make someone want to have children with you? Across the animal kingdom, sexual selection builds peacock tails so huge they're almost suicidal. It sculpts antlers that are more weapon than bone. And in humans, it may have whispered instructions about faces. Imagine a village on the steppe 10,000 years ago. Life is hard, winters are long, food is scarce. But young people still fall in love. They still glance across fires, still decide, consciously or not, who is beautiful, who is healthy, who feels like good mate material. Maybe they prefer smoother profiles. Maybe smaller, straighter noses become associated, in that particular culture, with youth, with health, with family status. The important thing is it doesn't need to be universal. It doesn't need to be logical. It just needs to happen often enough that people with certain facial features are slightly more likely to have children. Over thousands of years, those preferences can leave fingerprints in the genome. Anthropologists suspect this kind of soft cultural pressure has shaped all sorts of traits. Hair texture, skin markings, body proportions, noses could easily be among them. So while climate might set the broad stage, this region tends toward narrower or broader nasal passages, sexual selection could refine the details, straightening bridges, softening angles, shifting averages in directions that aren't strictly about breathing efficiency, but about the mysterious currency of attractiveness. And sometimes change doesn't follow any plan at all. While natural and sexual selection get most of the attention, there's another force always humming in the background: random genetic drift. Drift is evolution static. It doesn't care about usefulness. It doesn't care about beauty. It's just what happens when small populations roll genetic dice each generation. A trait can become more common not because it's better, but because by chance the people who happen to have it had more surviving children. Picture a tiny band of migrants leaving a larger Asian population and heading into a new, empty valley. Maybe there are only 30 or 40 of them. Their noses are just a random sample of the wider range back home. Maybe this group, by sheer coincidence, has slightly smaller average nasal height, or slightly flatter bridges, or a particular combination of cartilage and bone. They settle in. They grow. They stay relatively isolated. Within a few hundred generations, their once random facial traits have become the local norm. Climate may still be pushing softly in the background, but drift has already nudged the group into a new configuration of faces. Geneticists see echoes of this everywhere in human history, in island populations, in highland villages, in remote river valleys. Founder effects, where a small group carries only a slice of the original genetic diversity, can exaggerate traits that started out as minor quirks. So when we look at the incredible variation in Asian noses, from the high, prominent bridges of some Central Asians to the softer, smaller contours more common in East and Southeast Asia, it's likely we're not just seeing cold winds or humid summers written in bone. We're also seeing the residue of countless small chance events, frozen in family lines. Then there's the air itself, not just its temperature but its thickness. Some Asian populations live at altitudes where the sky feels thinner, where every breath carries less oxygen than at sea level. The Tibetan Plateau, the highlands of western China, parts of Central Asia. These are places where altitude is not background scenery, but a constant physiological challenge. We know that some groups in these regions carry special genetic adaptations, many of them inherited from Denisovans, that help them process oxygen more efficiently. These affect blood chemistry, hemoglobin levels, even how blood vessels behave. Could altitude also shape noses? It's plausible. High-altitude air is not just low in oxygen, it's often cold and extremely dry. A nasal cavity that can warm, moisten, and regulate airflow more efficiently might be advantageous. That doesn't necessarily mean smaller or larger noses in a simple sense. It might mean subtle changes in internal structure, turbinates, sinuses, airflow pathways that aren't obvious from the outside but could influence overall shape. We don't have a definitive, tidy answer here. What we have are hints, correlations between altitude, certain skull and nasal features, and the presence of Denisovan-derived genes that affect respiratory and circulatory systems. The picture is still fuzzy, but it suggests that for some Asian populations the story of the nose is not just about latitude and climate, but also elevation and the thinness of the air. And then there's something much more mundane, but surprisingly powerful. Food. Diet can influence how faces grow. Children don't just inherit genes, they also inherit lifestyles, what they eat, how they chew, how hard their jaws have to work. Traditional diets rich in tough fibrous foods force the jaws to do more mechanical labor. Softer diets place less strain on the chewing muscles and bones. Over time, this can affect the breadth of the face, the angle of the jaw, and how the midface develops. If the overall face becomes a bit narrower or less robust because of long-term changes in diet and chewing behavior, the nose doesn't stand alone, it's embedded in that framework. A shift in facial architecture can subtly reshape nasal appearance, projection, width, the apparent size of the nostrils, without any direct selection for nose shape itself. Some researchers think that as agriculture spread through parts of Asia, and as food processing techniques, cooking, grinding, fermenting, softened the average bite, human faces in those regions became more gracile, less massive jaws, smaller dental arches, a somewhat flatter mid-face. In that context, smaller or less projecting noses may simply be one piece of a broader pattern of craniofacial change tied to what people were eating and how. Looming behind all of this is a shadowy, ancient presence, the Denisovans. When modern humans moved into Asia, they didn't arrive in an empty world. They met and mated with at least one other human species. We know Denisovan DNA contributed to high-altitude adaptation in Tibet. We know it influenced immune systems in some Southeast Asian and Oceanian populations. But we don't yet have a complete fossil face of a Denisovan. We're piecing together their appearance from fragments and genetic echoes. It's entirely possible that some of the genes influencing facial growth, cartilage development, or nasal cavity shape in modern Asian populations have Denisovan origins. Not as a single, small nose gene, but as part of a complex orchestra of developmental regulators. A tiny shift in the timing of bone growth, a slight change in how cartilage responds to hormones. These microscopic differences, introduced by ancient interbreeding, could ripple out into visible population-level trends. What makes this especially intriguing is that Denisovans likely occupied a huge range of environments, from Siberia to tropical Southeast Asia, from sea level to mountain plateau. Their own evolutionary history would have mixed cold adaptation, altitude adaptation, and local ecological pressures in ways we're only beginning to imagine. When their genes entered the modern human gene pool, they brought that legacy with them. So when we ask, why are many Asian noses on average smaller or differently shaped than those in some other regions? The honest answer is layered. Climate and airflow are part of it. They probably set the broad parameters. Sexual selection may have refined those parameters as countless generations of people made quiet choices about what they found appealing. Random drift and founder effects would have amplified some features and diminished others, especially in small or isolated populations. Altitude likely sculpted nasal and respiratory systems in certain highland groups, sometimes using genetic tools borrowed from Denisovans. Diet and chewing behavior reshaped the underlying facial scaffolding, indirectly influencing how the nose sat on the face. and ancient interbreeding sprinkled in new variants that subtly altered the way faces and noses develop in the womb. No single explanation is enough on its own. Human faces are not designed by a solitary architect. They're jury-rigged by history, by ice and wind, by hunger and desire, by chance and migration, and the quiet pressure of everyday life. As you drift deeper into the story, you can think of the Asian nose not as an answer to a single question, why small, but as the outcome of a long tangled conversation between genes, environments, and choices stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. A conversation that, in many ways, is still ongoing. By the time our species reached what we now call Asia, they weren't walking into one uniform landscape, and they definitely weren't all growing one uniform kind of face. We talk about Asian noses as if there's a single template, a neat little sketch a cartoonist could draw in 3 strokes. But step back for a second and picture the land itself. Frozen tundra in the far north, rain-drenched jungles along the equator, high plateaus where the air feels thin even to modern lungs, endless deserts, humid river deltas, wind-blasted steppes. Now imagine tens of thousands of years of evolution operating quietly in all those different climates, on people who arrive at different times, mix in different ways, and face different challenges. Of course, they didn't all end up with the same nose. If you could float above Asia at night, watching time speed up, you'd see faces changing like a slow-motion kaleidoscope. Populations spreading, shrinking, overlapping. Trade routes lighting up, then going dark. Conquerors sweeping in, leaving behind children who carry stories in their bones and in the bridges of their noses. Let's zoom in, region by region, and that neat little idea of a single Asian nose starts to fall apart. In the far northeast, in places like northern China, Korea and Japan, winters could be brutal. Not quite the Siberian killing fields we talked about before, but cold enough, long enough, to matter. Here you often see what people think of as the classic East Asian profile. Smaller, more recessed noses, narrower nostrils, flatter bridges compared to, say, Europeans. But even within Northeast Asia, the story is more complicated. People in northern China are, on average, built a bit more robustly than people in southern China. Nose shape, cheekbones, even overall head shape show gradual shifts as you move from the warm, humid south up toward the cold, dry north. It isn't a line where one type ends and another begins. It's a gradient, a slow blending. Farther south, that gradient keeps changing. Travel into Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the climate flips. Hotter, wetter, more like the environments where our species first evolved. Here, noses often look less like the compressed cold nose pattern, and more like what you'd expect in the tropics. Broader bases, wider nostrils, smaller overall projection from the face. These features likely reflect something we touched on earlier, tropical adaptations. In hot, humid environments, you don't need to warm and humidify icy air. In fact, wider nostrils and a shorter nasal passage can be perfectly fine, sometimes even advantageous, for moving warm, moist air in and out efficiently. Many Southeast Asian populations also carry deeper traces of ancient Denisovan ancestry, and possibly ancestry from even older hominins that barely show up in the fossil record at all. Those ghost lineages may have contributed subtle differences to facial structure, cheekbones, jaws, nasal openings, that shaped how people's noses grow even today. In other words, while some northern East Asian groups were pushed by cold climates towards certain nose shapes, many Southeast Asian populations kept features more similar to our tropical ancestors, lightly modified by local conditions and long histories of farming, fishing and rainforest living. Move southwest again, into the Indian subcontinent, and the variation explodes. In South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, you can find almost every nose you can imagine. long, thin, highly projecting noses in some northern groups, straighter, medium-width noses in central regions, broader, rounded noses in some southern and coastal populations, and countless combinations in between. This is what you'd expect from a region that has been a crossroads for as long as humans have walked. South Asia has seen repeated waves of migration, early hunter-gatherers coming out of Africa, ancient West Eurasians drifting in from Iran and Central Asia, steppe pastoralists riding down from the north, Southeast Asian influences coming in along coasts and riverways. Each wave brought new genes, new faces, new noses. They mixed, blended and settled into local patterns. Then climate and culture nudged those patterns in different directions again. The Himalayas to the north added another layer. High-altitude populations, like some in Nepal and parts of northern India, carry genetic adaptations originally picked up from denisovans, variants that help them process oxygen in thin air. Those same populations sometimes show nasal shapes that reflect both high-altitude life and millennia of mixing between Central Asian, East Asian, and South Asian groups. Narrower in some villages, broader in others, with no single Himalayan nose to point at, shift north again into Central Asia, and the faces change once more. Here, in the lands of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Western China, people lived for thousands of years on open steppe. Cold winters, dry winds, long-distance travel as a way of life. This is where nose shapes start to look like a hinge between worlds. You can see features that lean toward East Asia, flatter mid-faces, less prominent bridges, narrower nostrils in some groups. But you also see features that lean toward West Eurasia, more projecting bridges, more downward-pointed nasal tips, sometimes taller noses overall. This isn't an accident. Central Asia has been a highway for as long as there's been history to record. Indo-Iranian speakers, Turkic nomads, Mongol confederations, Silk Road traders, Persian armies, Russian expansions, all of them moved through, conquered, settled, or passed along these routes. Each left behind descendants. Each contributed to the living mosaic of Central Asian faces. If you track nose shape, skin tone, eye shape, even blood types across these lands, you don't see neat racial boxes. You see gradients again, shifting slowly from Europe-like profiles in the far west toward more East Asian patterns in the far east, with endless mixtures in between. And then there are the outliers that remind us how messy history really is. Off the northern coast of Japan, on Hokkaido and nearby islands, lived a people whose faces puzzled early anthropologists, the Ainu. Traditional Ainu communities often show features that don't neatly match what many think of as Japanese. Fuller beards, more body hair, sometimes rounder eyes, and importantly for our story, often more projecting noses, bridges that stand out more from the face, nostrils that can be a bit larger and less compressed. For a long time, scholars argued about where the Ainu came from. Were they remnants of an ancient population that once stretched across northern Asia? Were they closer to early inhabitants of Japan, the Jomon people, before later migrations from the Asian mainland reshaped the island's gene pool? Did they share deeper ancestry with groups around the Pacific Rim? Current genetic evidence suggests that the Ainu carry a large portion of ancestry from Japan's early hunter-gatherers, with some mixing from later East Asian arrivals. Their distinct features, including their noses, likely reflect that older layer of population history. People adapted to northern forests and coasts long before rice farming, and imperial states reached the islands. In other words, the Ainu face is a time capsule, a record of what some ancient Northeast Asians may have looked like before later waves of migration smoothed many of those differences out. You can see similar time capsules scattered across Asia, minority groups tucked into mountain valleys, island communities that stayed relatively isolated, nomadic clans that maintained endogamy for cultural reasons, each preserving a slightly different blend of ancient and recent ancestry, each adding another variation to the spectrum of noses, eyes, and cheekbones. Overlay all of this with more recent history, Silk Road caravans carrying goods and genes between China and the Mediterranean, Arab traders sailing into Southeast Asian ports, Chinese diaspora communities settling from Manila to Malacca to Bangkok, European colonial powers bringing soldiers, administrators and intermarriage, and Asia becomes less like a set of separate regions and more like a vast overlapping web. Geneticists call the patterns that result clines or gradients. Instead of sharp boundaries between populations, you see slow transitions, each village shading into the next, each trade route acting like a brushstroke blending one palette of genes into another. That's why the idea of a single Asian nose doesn't hold up very well once you zoom in. In Northeast Asia, cold winters nudged noses one way. In Southeast Asia, tropical heat allowed older, broader shapes to persist. In South Asia, layer after layer of migration and mixing created a spectrum so wide it defies simple labels. In Central Asia, centuries of steppe empires mixed east and west into faces that look like crossroads made flesh. Among the Ainu and other distinct groups, pockets of ancient ancestry remind us that not everyone followed the same path. Trade, conquest, marriage, and shared stories turn the continent into a set of overlapping gradients rather than separate boxes. Climate set the stage, migration wrote the first drafts. Culture did the endless editing. When someone says Asian nose, they're really collapsing tens of thousands of years of these overlapping histories into two words. The reality on the ground and on the face is far more varied and far more interesting, and to see just how varied noses can be, we have to step back even further beyond Asia and look at what was happening on the rest of the planet, as different human groups met different climates and wrote their own stories in bone and cartilage. By now, it might be tempting to think of nose shape as something that neatly lines up with labels. Asian noses are like this, European noses are like that. Cold climate, warm climate, case closed. But human evolution almost never draws straight lines. It prefers swirls, overlaps, and exceptions. To see that clearly, you have to step back from Asia and look at faces from all over the world like you're slowly zooming out on a map of humanity. Let's start with something familiar. The classic story you might have heard in school goes like this. Europeans evolved long, narrow noses to deal with the cold. The idea is simple. Cold air rushing into your lungs can damage delicate tissues. A longer, narrower nasal passage gives that air more time and surface area to warm and humidify before it hits your throat and lungs. In this story, the big European nose becomes a kind of built-in radiator. There is some evidence that points in this direction. When researchers measure nostril width and internal nasal volume across different populations, they often find that groups from colder, drier climates tend to have narrower nostrils, more convoluted internal cavities, and longer nasal passages. This doesn't just show up in Europeans, it appears in multiple cold-adapted populations. But even here, things are messy. Southern Europeans, from places like Italy, Greece, and Spain, often have noses quite different from those of Northern Europeans. The climate is milder, more Mediterranean, and the nasal shapes reflect a complicated mix of ancestry, migration, and local adaptation. Meanwhile, some Northern Europeans have fairly broad noses, and some people from warmer regions have quite narrow ones. Individual variation swirls on top of population trends. So yes, cold adaptation likely played a role in shaping many European noses, but it's only one factor among many. Genetic drift, sexual selection, ancient migrations from different Ice Age refuges, even simple chance, all left their fingerprints on European faces. When you look at a European nose, you're seeing not just a reaction to climate, but a palimpsest of overlapping histories. If you really want to see what extreme cold adaptation can do to a face, though, you have to go farther north, past the forests, past the tundra, all the way into the Arctic. Think of the Inuit of Greenland and northern Canada, the Yupik and Aleut of Alaska, the Chukchi and related peoples of northeastern Siberia. For tens of thousands of years, their ancestors have lived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Not just cold, but brutally cold. Months of sub-zero temperatures, air so frigid and dry it can burn the inside of your nose with every breath. Here, the nose becomes a survival tool in a much more literal way. Many Arctic and subarctic groups show some of the most pronounced cold-adapted nasal features of any humans alive. Narrower nostrils, more complex internal nasal passages, sometimes a relatively higher, more projecting bridge that increases the distance the air travels before it reaches the lungs. But these features don't exist in isolation. They're part of an entire cold weather body plan. Shorter limbs relative to body size to reduce heat loss, stockier builds that conserve warmth, changes in fat distribution and metabolism that help with high-fat diets rich in marine mammals. The nose is just one piece of a broader Arctic adaptation puzzle. What's fascinating is that many of these Arctic groups are in deep time connected to the very Asian populations we've been talking about. Genetic studies suggest that the ancestors of Inuit and many Siberian peoples split off from Northeast Asian populations and then spent thousands of years adapting to extreme cold along the northern rim of the world. Their noses carry both stories at once, the older Asian roots and the newer Arctic refinements layered on top. From the frozen north, drift south in your mind's eye, across the Bering Strait, into the Americas. Most Native American populations carry clear genetic signatures of Asian ancestry. Their distant ancestors crossed from Siberia to Alaska sometime in the last 30,000 years or so, perhaps in multiple waves, during periods when sea levels were lower and land bridges or ice edge routes were available. Over millennia, they spread from the Arctic Circle all the way down to Patagonia, into climates ranging from tropical rainforest to high mountains to temperate plains. In their faces, you can still sometimes trace echoes of those ancient Asian origins. Certain patterns in eye shape, cheekbones, and yes, nasal structure can cluster in ways that point back toward Northeast Asia. Narrower nostrils and internal nasal shapes that likely emerged in cold northern Asia and Beringia can still be found in some high-latitude and high-altitude Native American groups. But the story doesn't stop there. As Native American populations moved into new environments, their bodies continued to adapt. In the Andes, high-altitude populations developed physiological responses to low oxygen that differ in subtle ways from those of Tibetans, despite both living high in the mountains. In the tropics, other groups adapted to humid heat, dense forests, and new disease landscapes. Over thousands of years, these pressures shaped their noses, faces, and bodies in different directions from their Asian cousins, even as the underlying genetic connection remained. You can think of Native American noses as a kind of living bridge, one end anchored in ancient Asia, the other spread out across an entire new hemisphere, diversified by time, climate, and culture. Now spin the globe again, back to where the story of our species began, Africa. When people talk loosely about African features, they're usually compressing the most diverse continent on Earth into a single, inaccurate image. From a genetic standpoint, Africa contains more human variation than the rest of the world combined. That's not a metaphor. It's a measurable, quantitative reality. Remember the out-of-Africa migration our species took. The groups that left were just a subset of the total African population at the time, a branch from a larger tree. Everyone outside Africa today descends from that relatively small branch. Everyone inside Africa descends from the whole forest. That depth of time and variation shows up in noses too. In humid equatorial regions, where keeping air moist is easy and overheating is a bigger problem, many populations evolved broader nasal openings. Wide nostrils and shorter nasal passages can help move large volumes of air quickly, useful in hot, often physically demanding environments. Move away from the equator, though, and you start to see other patterns. In the highlands of Ethiopia, in the Sahel, in parts of North and East Africa, there are groups with relatively narrower, sometimes more projecting noses. Some of these traits may reflect older adaptations to cooler, drier air. Others may come from ancient contacts with Near Eastern populations. Still others are simply the product of local evolutionary history, shaped by complex mixes of adaptation, drift, and migration. Across Africa, you can find almost every kind of nose seen anywhere in the world, often within relatively short geographic distances. It's a reminder that the simplified mental pictures many people hold, African nose, Asian nose, European nose, collapse under close inspection. They're more about stereotypes and colonial era classifications than they are about biology. When you step back and compare all these regions together, Europe, Asia, the Arctic, the Americas, Africa, a pattern begins to emerge that's both simple and profound. Climate matters, humidity matters, temperature, altitude, air dryness, all of these put pressure on the human nose, nudging it in particular directions over thousands of years. Cold, dry environments tend to favour narrower nostrils and more intricate internal passages. Hot, humid environments can tolerate broader openings and shorter airways. Intermediate climates sit somewhere between. But climate is never the only author. Migration moves people with one set of adaptations into entirely new conditions. Cultural practices influence mate choice in ways that can amplify or mute certain traits. Random genetic drift can make a feature common in one group and rare in another, with no deeper reason than the roll of evolutionary dice. Beneath all of those differences, something else remains constant. Whether you're looking at a narrow Inuit nose in the Arctic twilight, a broad West African nose in the humid heat, a high-bridged European nose in a winter storm, or a delicate Southeast Asian nose in tropical rain, you're always looking at variations on the same ancient theme. One fused chromosome carried out of a near-extinction bottleneck almost 1 million years ago. The same basic architecture of cartilage and bone, the same respiratory system, the same shared ancestry reaching back to small, scattered groups of humans clinging to survival in an unstable African landscape. Studying these patterns, who has which nose, where and why, isn't just about cataloguing differences. It's a way of reading the diary our species has written in its own flesh. Each shape hints at journeys taken, climates endured, and challenges overcome. Each curve and angle whispers, your ancestors were here, and they survived this. And when you line all those whispers up, across continents and millennia, they resolve into a single, quiet truth. However different our noses may look in the mirror, they are all variations within one species, one continuous story. The story of a small, fragile primate that learned to breathe almost any air on Earth and call it home. So where does all of this leave us? Here, now, with our phones on the nightstand, drifting off to sleep in climate-controlled rooms, breathing air that's been filtered, heated, cooled, and recirculated. Because even if the Ice Age is long gone, your nose never got the memo. It's still carrying design solutions that were field-tested over tens of thousands of winters and monsoons. And that ancient engineering actually matters today in ways that are surprisingly practical. Start with medicine. When a doctor looks up your nose, they're not just seeing a random tunnel. They're looking at a complex air processing system with a very specific evolutionary history. The width of your nasal cavity, the shape of your turbinates, the curved shelves of bone inside, the angle of your septum, all of that affects how you breathe, how you sleep, even how you get sick. Researchers have started noticing patterns. Populations whose ancestors lived in cold, dry climates, like parts of northern Asia, often have narrower internal nasal passages. Those passages slow down incoming air, giving it more time to warm and humidify before it hits the delicate tissue of the lungs. Great in an ice age blizzard, less great when you move to a modern city full of dry indoor heating, pollution and allergens. Some studies suggest that people with certain nasal shapes might be more prone to sinusitis, snoring, or sleep apnea when they're living in environments very different from the ones their ancestors adapted to. Others are looking at how nasal airflow patterns affect how well we filter out viruses or how efficiently we deliver inhaled medications. Surgeons who do reconstructive or corrective nasal surgery are paying attention too. They're starting to realize there's no single, perfect nose design. What works structurally and functionally for someone whose recent ancestry is from coastal Southeast Asia might not be ideal for someone whose ancestors spent millennia in Siberian steppe winters. Understanding the deep evolutionary logic behind different nose shapes can help doctors respect that variation, instead of trying to force every face into one narrow template. In a strange way, when a modern ENT specialist adjusts a deviated septum or opens a blocked sinus passage, they're having a quiet conversation with your Ice Age ancestors, tweaking a system that was optimized for mammoth winds and monsoon rains, and asking it to perform better in the world of commuter trains and office buildings. But the story of noses doesn't just live in clinics and operating rooms. It also shows up in crime labs and archaeological digs. Forensic anthropologists, scientists who study human remains, spend a lot of time looking at facial bones. The shape of the nasal aperture, the angle of the nasal bridge, the projection of the midface. These features can offer clues about a person's likely ancestral background. Not in a precise, deterministic way, but in probabilities and patterns. A partially preserved skull might tell a partial story. A narrow, high nasal opening could suggest ancestry from populations that spent a lot of time in cold, dry regions. A broader, lower nasal opening might point toward ancestries tied to warmer, more humid climates. Combined with other skeletal markers, this can help identify unknown remains, give names back to missing persons, and reconstruct the demographics of past populations. In archaeology, those same features help us trace ancient migrations. A shift in average nasal shape across a region can hint that new people moved in, or that existing populations began intermarrying with newcomers from different climates. It's another line of evidence beside DNA and artifacts that lets us watch human history unfold on the canvas of the face. But here, we have to be very careful, because the same features that help a scientist reconstruct a migration route can, in the wrong hands, fuel stereotypes and prejudice. People have used noses before as excuses to divide, to rank, to dehumanize. The 19th and early 20th centuries are full of grim examples, measuring noses with calipers, drawing absurd racial hierarchies, pretending that a few millimeters of bone could define a person's worth. Modern anthropology and genetics have demolished those ideas. There are no sharp genetic boundaries between so-called races. Human variation is continuous, messy, and full of overlap. Two people from different parts of Asia can have more genetic differences between them than either has with someone from Europe or Africa. No shape, like skin color, hair texture, or eye fold, is just one tiny piece of that variation. It reflects climate, chance, migration, and time. Not moral value, not intelligence, not character. Ethically, this means a few things. Researchers now emphasize that ancestry is about population history, not about rigid racial boxes. They talk about confidence ranges, not certainties. They recognize that physical traits can be shaped by culture, diet and environment as much as by genes. There's also a growing movement to involve the communities being studied in the research process, to ask what questions matter to them, to share results in understandable ways, to be transparent about limitations. Because when your own face becomes a scientific data point, it's natural to wonder who's looking and why. Underneath those concerns is a deeper question. What does it mean to study racial and ethnic differences ethically, in a world still grappling with the legacy of racism and colonialism? One answer is intent. Another is context. Scientists can explore why certain nasal shapes evolved without turning those explanations into value judgments. They can say, this shape likely helped your ancestors cope with cold, dry air, not, this shape is better, or worse, this shape is superior. They can frame variation as adaptation, not as hierarchy, and there is still so much we don't know. Even something as seemingly simple as nose width turns out to be complicated when you zoom in. Climate explains some of it, but not all of it. Genetic drift, sexual selection, random founder effects when small groups migrate, all of these likely play roles. Ongoing research is trying to untangle that web. Scientists are mapping which genes influence different aspects of nasal anatomy: bridge height, nostril width, cartilage thickness, internal airflow patterns. They're running simulations of how air moves through 3D models of different noses, testing how well each design warms, humidifies, and filters under different environmental conditions. Other researchers are looking at development. How much of nose shape is hardwired in the genome, and how much can be nudged by childhood environment, nutrition, or even breathing habits? How do the genes we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans tweak facial structure in different populations today? There are hints that some archaic gene variants are still subtly reshaping human noses, just as Denisovan DNA helps Tibetans handle high altitude. There are open questions too about timing. Did most of the distinctive nasal adaptations in Asia arise early, when modern humans were first moving into colder parts of the continent? Or did major shifts happen later, during particularly harsh glacial cycles in regions like Siberia and northern China? Different lines of evidence sometimes tell slightly different stories, and part of the work is reconciling them. And then there's the future. We evolved our noses under natural climates. What happens when we drastically change those climates in just a few centuries? On evolutionary timescales, modern climate change is a blink. Human biology probably won't have time to remodel the average nose shape of a continent before the environment shifts again. But there are subtler possibilities. As some regions become hotter and drier, others more humid, patterns of disease will change. Air pollution will interact with nasal anatomy in new ways. Some nose shapes might be slightly more vulnerable to certain irritants, while others might be marginally more protective. People might migrate in huge numbers, mixing ancestries and climates in combinations that never existed before. In that world, cultural adaptation will move far faster than genetic evolution. We'll build better air filters, change building designs, adjust work hours, invent new medications and surgical techniques. Our noses will still be tuned to the Ice Age, but our tools will help them cope with the Anthropocene. Over very long time spans, tens of thousands of years, it's possible that new selection pressures could gently nudge human nasal anatomy again. But if that happens, it will likely be in a future where technology and culture play such dominant roles that raw climate is just one factor among many. So as you lie there, listening to your own breath move quietly in and out, it's worth pausing on what that sound actually represents. Your nose is not small or large, flat or high, Asian or non-Asian in any simple way. It is a record, a living fossil, a tiny architectural summary of where your ancestors went, what they endured, which wounds they walked into, which storms they survived. For some, that record includes long winters on Asian steppes, where narrower nasal passages helped warm razor-cold air. For others, it includes humid river valleys and tropical coasts, where broader passages let heavy, saturated air move more freely. For many people, it includes multiple threads at once, a bit of Siberian cold, a bit of Southeast Asian heat, a splash of Central Asian steppe, all braided together in cartilage and bone. And beyond all that function, there is simple, quiet beauty. Stand in any busy Asian city, Tokyo, Jakarta, Delhi, Ulaanbaatar, and look at the faces moving past. You'll see an astonishing range of nasal shapes, straight bridges and softly curved ones, low profiles and high ones, narrow tips and rounded ones. Each one is an answer to a different set of ancient questions. How do we breathe here? How do we live here? How do we raise children here and keep them alive? The same is true everywhere on Earth. Every face you've ever seen is the endpoint of an unbroken survival chain stretching back through ice sheets and droughts, volcanic winters and monsoon floods, all the way to that tiny bottlenecked population clinging to existence hundreds of thousands of years ago. Understanding nasal adaptation doesn't make that diversity smaller. It makes it deeper. It lets you read it, the way an archaeologist reads layers of sediment, or a geneticist reads a strand of DNA. So when someone asks, why do Asians have smaller noses? The real answer is much bigger than a stereotype. It's a story about climate and chance, about migrations and interbreeding, about Neanderthals and Denisovans, about deserts and grasslands and glacial winds. It's about how flesh and bone carry memories that written history has long forgotten, and as research continues, as scanners get better, as DNA sequences pile up, as computer models grow more precise, that story will keep unfolding. We'll learn more about how air and bone and ancestry dance together. But even now, with all our questions still open, one thing is clear. There is no right way for a human nose to look. There is only the way it came to be, through millions of breaths taken by millions of ancestors, in 1,000 different climates, over a span of time almost too vast to imagine. Every inhale you take tonight is part of that same ongoing experiment, a quiet continuation of a journey that began long before anyone looked in a mirror and wondered what their nose meant. You are quite literally breathing history. So now, when you picture an Asian nose, or any nose at all, you're not just seeing a shape on a face. You're looking at the end of a path that started almost 1 million years ago, a path that runs from tiny scattered bands in ancient Africa, through ice sheets and deserts, through famines, plagues, and near extinction, all the way to the quiet room you're lying in right now. Some of those ancestors stayed in warm grasslands under heavy rains and soft air. Others walked north into bitter winds and endless winters. Still others turned east, into mountains so high the air itself became an enemy. At every turn, climate pressed on them like a sculptor's hand. Noses narrowed or widened, bridges rose or flattened, nostrils tucked close or opened wide. Not because anyone chose them, but because the people who happened to carry those traits breathed a little easier, survived a little longer, raised one more child to adulthood. In Siberia, in Central Asia, in the cold, dry plateaus of the north, that pressure was relentless. Generations grew up in air that burned their lungs and cracked their skin. Over thousands of years, faces shifted. Bones thickened here, thinned there. Air passages lengthened, curves softened, angles sharpened. What we now call East Asian features were once just survival strategies, tested over and over by winters that didn't care about beauty standards or modern stereotypes. And yet, for all that reshaping, the deeper story never changed. Under the skin, we stayed almost unimaginably similar. the same fused chromosome from the bottleneck survivors, the same basic toolkit of genes for lungs and brains and immune systems, a handful of small variations for cartilage thickness, or nasal width riding on top of a shared blueprint that is nearly identical in every person on Earth. If you could strip away the language, the passports, the categories printed on census forms, what would be left is one extended family. A family where cousins adapted to different weather, where some branches grew used to humid monsoon air, and others to icy steppe winds, but all of them trace back to the same tiny population that refused to die out. Your nose, whatever shape it is part of that testimony. It carries the memory of which winds your ancestors breathed, which dust they inhaled, which winters they endured. A low, soft bridge may whisper of ancient low plains and swirling snow. A high, narrow one may recall dry deserts and thin, bitter cold. Wide nostrils, narrow nostrils, prominent tip, barely a bump at all. Each one is a footnote in a long climate story that your body still remembers, even if your conscious mind does not. And yet, these visible differences, the ones we obsess over in mirrors and photographs, are paper thin compared to the things we share. The capacity for language shaped in the same bottleneck, the tendency to form families, to tell stories, to care for the sick, to bury the dead. The same ancient fear of the dark, the same need for warmth, the same slow drift into sleep at the end of a long day. As you're listening now, maybe with your eyes closed, maybe watching the soft glow of your screen fade, you are part of that unbroken chain. A line of survivors stretching back through ice ages and lost oceans, all the way to those 1,280 people holding on in a changing Africa. Every breath you take through your nose, no matter its size or shape, is a quiet echo of their struggle to keep breathing too. If this journey through deep time and silent features has kept you company tonight, you might gently tap-like before you drift off. If you feel awake enough, you can tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from, what climate your own ancestors might have faced, what winds shaped your nose and your neighbours, and if you'd like to help us keep making these long, calm dives into history, you can subscribe, so the next story is waiting for you when you're ready to sleep again. For those who want to support even further, there's also an optional channel membership here on YouTube. It's never expected, always appreciated, and only if it feels right for you. For now, you don't have to remember any dates or names or theories. You can just let the idea settle that your body is a history book written in bone and cartilage, in skin and breath. That every person you meet is carrying their own version of that book, slightly different on the surface, almost identical in its deepest chapters. Let your breathing slow. Feel the air pass through the nose your ancestors built for you, one generation at a time. Somewhere far behind you the ice has melted, the storms have passed, and the long march is over. All that's left tonight is a quiet room, a tired mind, and a story that can finally rest. Sleep well.